Howdy folks, Ryan here. We've got an episode for you about the film Oppenheimer, which did quite well in the Golden Globes and seems to be poised to do quite well at the Oscars coming up now. So should be still relevant because we should note that this episode was recorded several months ago. And we just have only gotten around to posting it now. And on a more personal note, we've been a little bit radio silence here for the last couple of weeks. And the reason for that is I recently had a kid about a week ago. And so, I've been totally swamped with handling all of that stuff. Any parents can tell you a newborn baby takes a lot of work. So, things may be a little bit disrupted here for a bit. But we hope you'll bear with us and cut us a little bit of slack. But at any rate, stay tuned. We'll be back soon with new episodes as the year gears up for a presidential election. I think it's going to be quite important to have, our kind of sensible perspective on the stakes and what's going to happen. And how, we in the left can push for the best possible outcome. But at any rate, I could stop procrastinating, and here's our episode about Oppenheimer right now.
Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we are talking about the film Oppenheimer. We're only, 4 months late to the discussion.
As promised, the second half of Barbieheimer, if you recall. We did the Barbie, which is the important preface to Oppenheimer. You have to watch Barbie first.
Is it Barbieheimer or is it Barbenheimer?
Yeah. Oh, Barbenheimer? Maybe it's Barbenheimer. Either way.
John Jacob Barbenheimer Schmidt.
Yes, but this is an evergreen film, I think.
Yeah.
So,
no, I think it's definitely still, maybe we're talking about now that the dust has settled a little bit on the discussion.
Plus, what just came out is the next biopic. I don't know what's in the air, but Napoleon has been made into a 3-hour film by Ridley Scott, and that just came out apparently. So the historical nerdy films or pop cultural films are all the rage these days. And at least Barbie and Oppenheimer, I would have never guessed that either of these concepts would have done well in the theater in terms of like revenue, nor necessarily as pieces of cinema or things worth talking about necessarily on the podcast. But I don't know about you. I think both of them are. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Maybe we can return to Napoleon. I hear that one's kind of a turd. Ridley Scott strikes me as kind of a dumb guy at the end of the day.
He's a little less thoughtful than Christopher Nolan, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where I think I would sort of start the discussion off, would just be to say like, it's a solid film, and it's pretty remarkable how well it did. It didn't do as well as Barbie, I don't think. But it still made, did it crack $1 billion? I mean, it was into the high hundreds of millions at least. And 3-hour drama that's mostly like guys and people in rooms talking to each other. That's like really holds your attention.
Yeah, the last act of which is about a committee hearing.
Yeah, a committee hearing in a small room. And people that know movies say that like editing a movie like that, like 12 Angry Men, is really hard. Filming it and setting it up so that like the pacing is maintained and so on. And where all you have is people sitting down next to each other and talking, that is very challenging. You don't have a lot of tips. Like shooting a car chase might be technically challenging in terms of the stunt coordination and stuff like that, but that's much easier in terms of like the grammar of film and whatnot. To make
Absolutely.
It exciting.
But plus, Christopher Nolan is known for his visuals. And I thought going into this, well, apart from the obvious visual of, the bomb, what are you going to do for 3 hours that's visually interesting? It's a bunch of eggheads like in their labs or classrooms or whatever. And he does it. He does it. I mean, it's to me a remarkable feat of cinematography, writing, and editing to make a 3-hour film on this topic, propulsive and a political thriller. Really, a political thriller, a drama, a character study. I mean, I think just in terms of filmmaking, not an ounce of fat, I didn't think. Even maybe you could say in that third act with the committee hearing, maybe you could find somewhere to cut. But I thought it was pretty propulsive and captivating the whole time.
Yeah, earned its length, I would say. Yeah, and I saw it. A brief aside, I saw it in Finland at like a knockoff IMAX. It's like IMAX, but not really IMAX. A really stadium seating type thing with a really big screen. Absolutely full house. I don't think there was a single empty seat. And the funny thing about Finland is, so they have like the pre-show stuff, and rather than commercials, there was like I think there were a few commercials in there, but there was like a 5-minute interlude where there was a little like quiz show thing, an animated program where it was telling you about how to ride your bike safely in the street.
I knew there was going to be a PSA. That's like fantastic. You might be worried about nuclear holocaust, but make sure that you arrive to the theater safely by riding your bike properly.
Yeah. Here's where you have right of way. Here's where you need to watch out. Wear a helmet.
The danger's big and mundane.
It was all in Finnish, so I was sort of guessing at what the content of it was, but it seemed pretty clear. Bike safety PSA. And yeah, I think the average cinema goer is not as dumb as Hollywood executives think that they are. They just think, oh, we'll just keep shoving the same superhero slop down their throats year after year. And like, that's fun in itself. But, there's an unaddressed market here for like intelligent films that are well made. And, you put a good marketing budget behind them and hey, look, people like watching it because it's good.
And people like to learn also, especially in areas that aren't, someone's area of expertise. You have physics, you have politics, history, you have, all kinds of interesting things that you can learn about not just our past, but about politics that relates to today. And we'll get into that a bit, I'm sure, with the anti-communist McCarthyite stuff and other things. But, it's not easy to make a film that is relevant, but also illuminating about the history of important parts of our past, as well as, moral and philosophical and existential themes that are explored through a personal journey. And it's not easy to pull off and not get either sentimental or boring or, reductionist. So, so from us, and this is another thing where people were kind of ripping into it from the left and the right in the reviews for various reasons. And I'm getting more and more skeptical about those kind of negative reviews. When something makes a lot of money and a lot of people think it's really good, more often than not, I'm going to assume that somebody just enjoys being a kind of nonconformist or a, kind of curmudgeon who hates what people like, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, that's maybe a good place to actually dig in a little bit. So like we've sort of talked around a little bit, but, brief plot summary, tune out if you want to go in blind. But, so this is a story of J. Robert Oppenheimer and basically how he came to assemble a team of physicists at Los Alamos in New Mexico for the Manhattan Project to build the first nuclear bomb, to develop the science and the technology and the engineering, et cetera, to set it all up. And then later, the story of how his security clearance was revoked and by a fellow named Louis Strauss right? They say that he insists that it's not Strauss, as you would say in German, right? He's calling it Strauss, which maybe we could talk about that, what that reveals a little bit. And then Strauss's attempt to be confirmed as a Secretary of Commerce under Eisenhower, and how his basically orchestrating the end, the downfall of Oppenheimer's career affected that proceeding. And so, yeah, maybe we could talk a little bit about how the movie portrays Oppenheimer, because there's some takes that you see that say it is sort of like straightforwardly heroic or like a sort of tragic look at like a very sympathetic portrayal of him. And I don't agree with that at all. Like, it's definitely a tragic story. Yeah. But I would say, like, in the sort of more classical Greek sense, in which like the protagonist is brought low by his tragic flaw, and it's a real flaw. It's not some sort of slight character blemish on an otherwise perfectly heroic person. Like, the movie portrays him as kind of a bastard, there's notes of even so the most.
Let's get into that. So tell me what you think the film is showing about his character in terms of, like, I guess we could get to how his vices relate to the tragedy or the kind of the role he plays in history that has the consequences it has. But what's your take on kind of what kind of person they portray him as, his virtues and vices? Yeah,
so he is definitely, maybe ambition, you would say, is his tragic flaw. Because he's basically picked up to like run the Manhattan Project, because this one general, I forget his name, basically recognizes that this is the guy. He has the combination of like administrative talent and scientific brilliance, that he can like run herd on all these wild haired, lefty crazies who, constitute the major scientific talent of the country, and lots of Europe too.
It's almost like he has the arrogance to make, to like make gutsy calls and do what has to be done or something. You think, right? Like, it takes a lot of arrogance and a hubris, frankly, which is of course the classic tragic flaw, to think that you should be in charge of a project like this, right?
Yeah, that's a better characterization of it: hubris and arrogance. Because he's shown to be a cocky bastard, and he makes like an enemy of this Strauss guy by he's offered, Strauss is this sort of like supplicant. He thinks Oppenheimer's this like super brilliant guy. He wants to have him at his like university, right? His institute.
At Princeton, right.
And Oppenheimer's like, I'll consider it. This is like incredibly prestigious appointment, and he's like just sort of like, I'll think about it. Real asshole.
And that's an interesting foil too, because let's talk about this is Robert Downey Jr.'s character. He's the chair of what would be the Atomic Energy Committee, even though he might have a science background a little bit, but he's not a physicist. He's what he calls a self-made man. And I think actually he is supposed to be maybe the picture of the ultimately self-interested, ambitious man, right? Like a self-made, whether in politics or in business, the kind of, the person who's really all about their own power and ascendance, and who has a chip on his shoulder a little bit, because he doesn't, he might have that kind of ambition and maybe some street smarts, right? But he doesn't have like the genius of Oppenheimer, right? And I think that the hubris and arrogance of Oppenheimer is in contrast, because I don't know that Oppenheimer is actually ambitious, or at least I don't think he's necessarily portrayed as ambitious in the same way.
No,
I think he thinks he's the smartest when it comes to this stuff. And he thinks that that's why he should be in charge. It's almost like he wants to be in charge in like a philosopher king type of way, right? Like he thinks he deserves it because he knows what's what. Whereas, Robert Downey Jr.'s character, he just wants power, right? And I think that's an important distinction, even though they both reveal important vices and problems.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah. Ambition. Yeah. Pure ambition is not the right way to put it. Because if you're just ambitious, like Strauss is just ambitious, he's out to win by any way he can. And,
he has no integrity, and he has no, he doesn't care what he has to do to get where he has to get. And therefore, he probably has no conscience. Whereas like a whole lot of this film is about the guilty conscience of Oppenheimer, right?
Yeah, pretty much the whole second half of it, because it's like his downfall, as it were, is that he succeeds. He creates this nuclear bomb, and then he's like, fuck, what have I done? And, spends, I think it strongly implied that he basically falls on his sword. He like loses this committee hearing on purpose, or he doesn't fight as hard as he could have because he thinks that he deserves to be punished. And the movie also suggests that is kind of pathetic a little bit, that like he's being very, self-centered in terms of it really wasn't entirely about you at one point.
That's right.
He has his communist mistress who he then, says like, I can't see you anymore. This isn't going to work out. And she kills herself. And then he goes and he like hides in the wilderness, and his wife comes and is like, you don't get to be sad and run away from everything just because you did a bad thing,
Yeah, that's right. No, I think this is a super important theme that's really interesting to me, because there's a tendency that maybe we all have, I don't know, to feel like kind of self-castigation and guilt is somehow the proper moral response, when it's actually just like a psychological self-soothing.
Yeah.
Right. And it actually is a fairly, solipsistic, narcissistic thing to do, to make it about you, especially when you're talking about killing hundreds of thousands of people and unleashing this kind of power for violence on the world. But I also think that part of the movie is trying to show that he's wrong in blaming himself. Like, I think there's a link between the culpability he thinks he has for her suicide. So the character played by Florence Pugh, I don't know if that's how you pronounce her last name. So she's a communist he has a love affair with early on, I think even before he gets married, and it continues. It doesn't continue actually, but he kind of has a one-off reunion with her while he's married to Emily Blunt's character, Catherine Oppenheimer, right? So Jean Tatlock is Florence Pugh's character. She's the commie. She's a psychiatrist or psychologist, something like that, right? And the truth is, she's obviously a depressive. Like, I don't know what specific diagnosis would be right for her, but she has issues that have nothing to do right with Oppenheimer. And in fact, when he like goes full out for her before he even gets married, she basically says, no, I can't do that. I'm not going to give it, I'm not going to give you that. I can't, whatever. And she thinks that she'll be happier that way. But then it turns out after he gets married, she like appeals to him and says, well, I was wrong. Actually, I can only be happy with you and all that. And he decides in that moment, like after that, like one affair with her, he decides like, nope, actually, I can't do this. So he makes a decision that's not the right thing to do. And then he feels responsible when she kills herself after that. Right. I think there's a parallel between that and his feeling of moral culpability for what happens with nuclear power and nuclear war and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all that. Right. Like, because the truth is, the complexity of the moral disaster that happens is far beyond one man's decision making or one man's contribution or whatever, right? It's in fact, it's a very complex situation, because initially when he is all about this project, it's because he's Jewish and he's seeing Jews being massacred by the Nazis, and the Nazis are going to get the bomb first if the Americans don't. And then, as he says at one point, I'm like, I don't know that we'll do the right thing with this, but I know that the Nazis won't, right? Like, yeah. And, that's kind of hard to argue with. The problem, of course, is that we beat the Nazis before they developed the bomb anyway, right? That's the big problem morally, eventually.
Yeah.
Like at the time of his decision, it was, I think, a real quandary. Like, if we don't develop this, it's going to be developed by the bad guys, right?
No, I think at the time I almost certainly would have agreed with him on that point wholeheartedly. You know, this is just the Hitler Nazi regime is like can there be any question whatsoever? Had they had it, they would have used it on, anybody on London or on Washington or New York if they could have gotten that far, or Moscow, and yeah, it's on the moral culpability thing. There's an important scene, I think, with Truman that is a little, it's a little historically inaccurate, but he goes to meet Truman and he talks about, it's like, he says, I think I have blood on my hands, and Truman just like is disgusted. He's like, he calls him a pussy or something.
Crybaby.
A crybaby. And the implication being that's like, you built this, you didn't order it to be used. And it's like, get over yourself type of thing. But I think that the movie sort of ultimately lands on the idea, because after the whole dispute with Strauss, is over whether, they should develop the hydrogen bomb, and Oppenheimer's against it for, I think, the movie implies, and I think historically were kind of bullshit reasons. He's like, oh, it's not important to do, fission or whatever it is. I forget exactly what he says, but I think his actual motivation is he doesn't want the technology to be advanced anymore.
He was saying it's not practical or something on one level, but really it was kind of clear it was for moral reasons. He just knew that the moral objection wasn't going to be heard politically at all, basically. Right?
Yeah. And so, even if you are a little narcissistic in terms of like, taking on too much blame for this yourself and making it all about you, it's still better to be guilty and to try to like stop nuclear proliferation than it is to just be like Strauss and like full on ahead. Like, let's just, play the power politics of the military industrial complex.
Yeah, well, and here's where the kind of the cynical anti-communism can come in. And there was like legitimate true believers in the Cold War, a necessity to like look out for sympathizers with the regime, But the truth is, his approach, which was arms control and adhering to what even I don't know if the film shows this, but even Truman kind of agreed to, a development of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons that's kind of controlled internationally, and that has kind of a transparent, open flow of information. And this is, again, the UN has kind of only recently been established, and he doesn't want to get into an arms race because I think he says at one point, like, when we were developing the nuclear bomb, it didn't occur to him that what he later saw to be true was the case, which is that any weapon we develop, we will use. Like, if it gets developed, it's going to be used. And the realization of that, because they do some great showing, not telling, where they finally completed the bomb and successfully done the test. And Oppenheimer thinks like, okay, I still get to be involved now, right? And what happens next? And basically the military is like, yep, we're taking it from here. See you later, buddy. like thanks for doing the legwork, but now we're totally in charge of the use of this power, right? And that's when I think he starts to be like, uh-oh, this could be bad, right? Even though he's involved in discussions around the strategic use of the bomb in Japan, that's when he starts to get really aware that like this could be abused in a way that's really, really bad. And the politics there are kind of interesting, around picking a target and the idea that it has to be used not just once but twice. So yeah, I think the later McCarthyite stuff, where his kind of running the same circles and having an affair with a communist, even his wife, She used to be part of the Communist Party, but she, on the stand in the hearing, she makes a great point that like, well, yeah, that was the American Communist Party, and there was like a divergence pretty clearly of people who didn't like what was going on in the USSR, especially like when Stalin took over, right? Like, there were people that no longer thought that you could be a communist in this country without having sympathies for the USSR. And anyway, it delves into things kind of interestingly, but basically his associations are used as a cudgel to really prevent his politics of international treaties and arms control and the things that he wants to like prevent mass destruction again. And I think that's something today that you see all the time, that the reactionary right uses kind of jingoistic anti-communist rhetoric in order to prevent people from advancing politics that are liberatory and peace advocating, and that this is something that has just been repeated since then, right? Over and over.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the takeaway, from the whole McCarthy period, because like the Soviets did have, I believe in reality, they had spies, or they had people who gave them like technical information from the Manhattan Project. That's how they were able to develop the bomb so quickly themselves. There were tons of Soviet spies throughout the whole American government in the 40s. The guy, God, what was his name? Harry Dexter White, who designed the Bretton Woods like whole global monetary system with John Maynard Keynes and all the other people at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. He was, if not a Soviet spy, someone who had like passed information to Soviet agents on many occasions. No sign whatsoever that the Bretton Woods system was designed to benefit the Soviets, of course. On the contrary, it was overwhelmingly biased towards, American needs. But still, that was like a real thing. And, McCarthy didn't know shit about any of that. He wasn't interested in actually like controlling or rooting out actual Soviet espionage and doing counter espionage effectively. It was about whipping up a moral hysteria to basically persecute leftists and liberals to a great extent, to tar them as pinkos. And that was, right. I believe, one of, during that trial, it's like they talk about during the bomb project, like the Soviet Union was allied with the United States. Like it's not treason necessarily, like to say like, okay, I'm giving sensitive nuclear information to like Britain or France,
and he's very nuanced. Oppenheimer is very nuanced. He's like, first of all, it strikes me as strange for it to be objectionable to share such things with our allies. But I realize it would be treason because that's not my decision. I'm not the elected representative to make that decision. But still, I would advise the president to share this information with our allies.
Yeah, exactly.
But the nuance is all lost in those situations, right? That's not what matters, because, like you said, it's not about that, right? Although in the war, not the Cold War, but World War II, the general played by Matt Damon. And I do think there's something also really well done here in the characterization of different military figures, as well as different physicists and different politicians, even like the staff aide who is kind of prepping Robert Downey Jr. for the committee hearing and of his Senate confirmation hearing. Not all people of a type are cast in the same light. Like, the physicists are very different. Even the Jewish physicists are very different in many ways. The politicians are different. The military people are different. And there's a lot of nuance there, right? I find. So even if like the military industrial complex functions overall in a certain way, the character, for example, played by Matt Damon, he kind of understands the need for these radical lefties, to be in charge of the Manhattan Project, because they're the ones that can get this done. And he kind of understands that the security fears are somewhat legitimate, but also a little overblown. And like there's a kind of give and take, and he has some skill in navigating the clearance initially for Oppenheimer. And then you have kind of a lot of, I think, views into the very real dangers that are at play here. And then the people, and I think this is maybe an overarching theme, the people who are actually interested in navigating those complexities, and whether they're a general or a physicist or whatever, and the people who are just abusing the complexity in order to have their own agenda pursued, right, for power.
Yeah, that other general, Boris Pash. Yeah, so Casey Affleck plays a different general named Boris Pash, who is a fanatical, like, right-wing anti-communist. And foolishly divulges some stuff about his associations to this guy. And then is advised by Matt Damon's character, that like, oh, you idiot. Why did you say that?
You trusted this guy just because he's military. You trusted him. You know, you naive fool. I do really think that there's this kind of modernity has unleashed these very complicated problems, and there are people who abuse those problems for their own gain, or are just fascists, or are just, you know, whatever. And then there are people who are like doing their best, and no matter how much they try to do their best, there's a lot of problems with what comes just because of the nature of the situation, right? Because even Matt Damon's character, who seems like as good a guy as you can have, I mean, this is a general who also was an MIT engineer, I think, if I recall correctly. And because of the nature in the third act, because of the nature of the act that was passed about atomic energy after the war, he's basically asked, would you give security clearance for Oppenheimer now, according to this act's requirements? And he can't do it, even though he wants to stand up for Oppenheimer as much as he can. And that's just the complexity of the political situation, right?
Yeah.
So
the hysteria of the Red Scare, and that, it should be noted parenthetically that almost the exact same thing happened after the end of the First World War, when you had, basically an absolute fucking flip out over, supposed communist infiltration of the government and so on, and massive, basically, police state actions and the Palmer raids and whatnot to basically crush an incipient socialist movement, which hitherto had been like quite strong in many states, like Oklahoma won like 25% of the vote. But yeah, I think that whole, sequence there, as like the bomb is finished and Oppenheimer is sort of unceremoniously shunted to this, away from control of the, technology, and then eventually out of, the whole national security establishment, entirely. It's a pretty good little, encapsulation of how, the war effort, like the American left was sort of co-opted and then spit out and trodden under the boot heel of the American state. It was just sort of used for convenience. And, a lot of these guys that were, I mean, this book the movie is based off the book American Prometheus, right? And the guy who stole fire from the gods, and his punishment was to be chained to a rock and have his liver eaten by an eagle every day until the end of time. And that, sort of follows that sequence pretty precisely. I
think a good kind of allegory, though, for just the problems of modernity writ large, and for the left, I think the fact that, in a way, the politics of this film are, I think, very good. I mean, Oppenheimer is a fellow traveler with the commies, but he also sees that there are problematic things. He doesn't like dogma. But he tries to unionize, and he gets in trouble for that. You have, I think, fundamentally an awareness of the potential. First of all, he's a guy at the very beginning that you're introduced to who has an awe of the universe and has a love of learning about what is. And there's like a wonder, like science is just wondrous and beautiful and fascinating. And he's also reading like T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and listen to Stravinsky, and like modernity brings with it. And he's looking at a Picasso. Like, there are these fascinating revolutions in art, in science, in literature and poetry. And modernity brings with it so much that is, I think, excellent and worthwhile and beautiful. But with those things, including with the technological advances and the advances of science, come terrible problems and terrible abuses of these advances and these changes. And so I think he's a character who his journey kind of traces the journey of modernity through what is like an amazing promise of advancement. And like, we can feed all kinds of people in amazing ways. We have these energy advances. We have all these things that we could do to ourselves and for ourselves and with this knowledge. And yet there's so many terrible things now we can do to ourselves and to each other. And like, it's Pandora's box, right? Like, you can't unring that bell. So what do? And I think his inclination as a lefty is you need to cooperate. You have to have, like, all the physicists have to come together. All of the politicians have to come together. You have to break borders. You have to think about the fact that, like, you know, there's all these dangers that we can only control if we think together about a common good that is like international, you know? You have to have a humanism that's really profound if you want to make the most of these advances and not destroy ourselves. And I think that is still the kind of truth that we have today, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And we should note that, you know, even though Oppenheimer lost his internecine political battles towards the end of his life, like that, his approach was followed in the later Cold War. You know, the basic fundamentals of it with the, you know, test ban treaty and, you know, strategic, you know, whatever the arms limitation treaty is basically, that's you know, right. You had the arms race going for a long time. And then people are just like, well, all we are doing is building up the power to like make the rubble bounce 3 or 4 more additional times after everyone is already dead. You know, like, what on earth are we doing here? And yeah, there were diplomatic agreements, to, you know, just cut down to where, I mean, you know, it's not exactly the ideal outcome, but just to say like, okay, you know, one or 2 times, to destroy the entire human race is probably enough for everyone. And, something, by the way, I wanted to mention on Truman. You know, we mentioned before how, you know, Truman expresses contempt as, you know, implying that like, it's his responsibility. And so, you know, these sissy scientists saying it was my responsibility is wrong. The interesting thing, you know, that I think sort of partakes of the historical, you know, the conventional wisdom, I guess, that you see in the media, that Truman did directly order the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Japan. That is not true. The only order that Truman explicitly gave was to stop the dropping of nuclear weapons after the second one. And it was explicitly because he was morally horrified at all of the civilian casualties. He said, I just can't, it's something like all those kids in the order.
That's right.
It was, you know, as Oppenheimer, you know, says in the movie, it's like once it's built, then it's in the control. If we build it, we're going to use it. And I think that, you know, you see, arguments for why the nuclear bomb was dropped, that for what's that guy's name? Gar Perlowitz, whatever his name is, that it was actually intended to like intimidate the Soviet Union.
That's right. That it had nothing to do with Japan, really. It was about the Soviets.
I'm unconvinced by that as the primary motivation. Like, that might have been in there, but I think it was basically just like, we're building it, we're going to use it right away. Like it was just berserker rage, death. It wasn't even go ahead.
Even one of their stated reasons, because you have this, like, the physicists are like, well, wait a minute, we beat the Germans. How long is Japan going to hold out? And then there's this kind of absurd moment where, like, seemingly the guy running the meeting, he's like, I've got a list of whatever it was, like 13 potential cities. He's like, actually, let's make it 12. My wife and I went to Kyoto. It's a beautiful place. We're not going to do it there. But I thought that was, I don't think it was meant to be comical, but it's comical in a way that's revelatory. It's like,
gallows
this
humor.
Asshole in power, because of his vacation with his wife, gets to save this city and all these people on a lark, but for like a reason that's legitimate. Like, it's a beautiful place with all these people. But by that logic, you shouldn't do that fucking thing to anyone. These are all places with people that have their own beauty and whatever,
Yeah.
But they say, the first bomb is to show them that we have it, right? And then one might ask, well, why do you need the second? Oh, to show them that we'll keep using it until they surrender. Okay, do you really need to use it more than once to show that you'll keep using it? Like, is it to show that you have more than one? Like, what is it? Like, I don't know. It just, it seems to have, there are plenty of easy rationalizations, but,
yeah,
I'm no expert in the debates, historically about what was or wasn't necessary, but,
yeah, from what I've read, the nuclear weapon was not central to the Japanese decision to surrender. That it was as much about the Soviet declaration of war as anything else, and it almost certainly could have been avoided entirely. But it was. I think the whole war was just a war of like virtual extermination until they would surrender. It was just like, whatever we've got, we're going to throw at them without thinking about it at all. And, that's like the great movie, Fog of War, but with, Robert McNamara. He talks about strategic bombing of Japanese cities. There are way more people killed by, incendiary bombs being dropped, across Japan than by the nuclear bombs. And 100,000 people in Tokyo just burned the whole city to the ground, intentionally, to kill as many civilians as possible.
It's a reminder that all the war crime international laws came as a result of things that we also did. That wasn't just about the Axis powers and what they did, whether it's Dresden or Japan. I mean, just like war crimes against humanity. And I mean, think of it this way. So what, 200,000 people or so ultimately died from the 2 atomic bombs, right? Well, okay. In about a month in Gaza, Israel has killed about 20,000 people, right? So that's like a tenth of the 2 nuclear bombs, right? Just because. Right.
Yeah. I think you could see why military people would be so callous about dropping a nuclear bomb. It's like, well, who cares if you're blown up by radiation or you're burned to death in a firestorm? You're still dead, or like grossly mutilated if you're, out the back a ways. And, I think that, one of the reasons why the nuclear bomb was considered so horrible is that it kind of recontextualized the entire conflict up to that point. It was like, oh God, what are we doing to them and to ourselves? By countenancing this sort of like horrific, deliberate mass murder of hundreds of thousands of civilians to win a war. And even, and perhaps worst of all, I mean, I think this almost makes the U.S. sort of action even worse, that like they didn't even think about that much, whether it would force the Japanese to surrender or not. It was just like, fuck them. It was like blood rage after Pearl Harbor, and they won't surrender, and just keep pounding them with anything and everything. Who cares about civilians, men, women, and children until punishment. Yeah. And that, there was at no sense ever any sort of cold-blooded rationality in terms of either intimidating the Soviets or considering what the minimum possible, infliction of loss of life that could achieve the objective. It was just like, we did it. We'll do it because we could. Wars are like that. I think a lot of times people, they lose their humanity and just become, just bestial, violent, creatures bent on death.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it's a way of being, and a way of being that's about non-being, right? I mean, so much of modernity, and that I think this film explores well, implicates what Hannah Arendt thought was the most important kind of call for us in the 20th century and after, which is to, as she put it, to think what we are doing. And by doing, she had a very, well thought out understanding of the concept of action and what what she meant by what we are doing included the fact that technology and advances in not just weapons, but other forms of technology were outstripping our understanding of the consequences of using those technologies, or of like the tail was wagging the dog. And we are starting, like with modernity, we are starting to do things in a way that has the product of what we're doing is dictating things to us rather than vice versa. Right. And that I think is more and more true with whether it's climate change or pandemics or what have you. Like, we need to stop and think before we do, more than ever. Like, this is the problem of the 20th century and beyond. And nothing reveals that more than the idea with like a push of a button, you could just annihilate, obliterate, right? What you can with a nuclear weapon. And that's just one symptom of this capacity that we have made things that kind of can, and with AI maybe now too, can no longer, they will no longer listen. Like the falcon cannot hear the falconer. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So that, but I think too that this film is very interesting in that it also delves into like interpersonal complexities and this difficult marriage. I thought the portrayal, Emily Blunt, was fantastic. Like the female actresses were phenomenal. Florence Pugh, Emily Blunt. Catherine Oppenheimer is an interesting character. She's someone who's had a really rough life. Like this is her, third or fourth marriage. But the reasons for that are so interesting insofar as like, whether it's war or sexism, like the condition that she's in and being in this kind of somewhat unhappy marriage, which we can get into a little bit. And she's like a brilliant biologist, but she's basically only permitted to be a housewife. You know, she is an alcoholic for reasons that I think, you know, a reactionary person might say, oh, she's just given into personal vices, but really reveal the kind of problems of the 20th century that have to do with war and sexism and the ways that brilliant women were limited and oppressed and all these things. And yet she manages in the end to really come through for her husband and in a kind of remarkable scene where she testifies, right? But I thought their marriage was portrayed in a very interesting way because, to be honest, Oppenheimer was more in love, or perhaps properly in love, with the communist who had the mental illness and killed herself and so forth. And in a way, you know, maybe Catherine Oppenheimer settled for him too, because she'd gone through so many different marriages and yet she ended up being stuck with someone who was devoted to this project and to being this important person. And so she had the kind of secondary role of supporting him and all that. And maybe she was a little depressed too from the problem that he was involved with, the problem of modernity. I don't know. What did you think about the characterization of her and their relationship?
Yeah, it's definitely implied that she drinks because, you know, she's a brilliant, ambitious scientist who's forced to take care of children without any help, you know, from her husband. It's like he comes back really late and the baby is crying and she's like sitting at the table drinking. And he's like, well, shouldn't you go to him? And she like sort of staggers off. It's like, I've been going to him all day. And I'm not like, dude, pick up your kid. Well, what does he do? He pawns it off on somebody else, like takes it to, I forget who, but like one of his friends or relatives.
Like an English professor, or I think another Berkeley professor, who actually gets him in trouble later on for trying to be a kind of commie go-between. We don't have to get into that, but he's someone who based Chevalier, right? He actually is one of the reasons that the Oppenheimer gets in big trouble. But he and his wife take in the baby for a while, I guess, right? Although that reminds me of an important scene where, like, when Oppenheimer is doing this, he's embarrassed and he's full of shame and guilt, and he says, "I'm sorry," you know, basically like. I don't forget if he said we as he and his wife, or I am like very selfish. And the Chevalier professor has a great response. He's like, no, like you just need help. You know, selfish people don't acknowledge and realize that they're selfish. Like that's I think that's the key difference between Oppenheimer and like Robert Downey Jr.'s character, right? Like a truly self-involved, selfish person, self-important person. Because another great line is like, snap out of it, asshole. You're not just self-important, you're actually important. Yeah. Right? Like for the world, and that's a great distinction. But like someone who's so morally concerned with their actions isn't actually as bad as somebody who is truly vicious because they don't care. They're not reflective on that, like in that way. They're just doing what they're doing.
Yeah. And maybe to answer your question, I think more directly, it shows how, the post-war gender roles and so on, and, the ambitious scientist sort of persona and whatnot, it cuts, Oppenheimer off from like his own family. It's like, this is supposed to be one of the great joys of life, right? Raising your kid, your son, your, son and heir, presumably. And, also from, relatedly to the person who ends up being his most loyal companion despite himself, the person who stands up for him, even while like his sordid affairs are being like dragged through, a sort of hearing with a lot of, hostile people listening to every salacious detail. She still, sticks by him out of, stubbornness, loyalty, love, whatever the reason. It's like, that you can't help but think it's like that these people might have been a lot happier and better for each other if they had like a more reasoned ability to actually communicate with each other, and a social context that wasn't so suffocating for women and for men to a lesser degree.
That's right. Yeah. I think too, though, there are trade-offs. I remember having a student who was talking to me about, I don't know, she was fed some kind of reactionary nonsense about Greta Thunberg, and something about how she's not a good role model because she dropped out of school or something like this and that. And it was clear she was just fed some attack propaganda on Greta Thunberg. And I said, well, okay, so maybe you don't want her to be a role model for you in terms of like how you pursue your personal life. But maybe that's not the point of her, right? Maybe the point of her isn't about, this is how you should order your personal affairs and your career trajectory and your education. Like maybe too, that certain people who become important in the world might not be great husbands, or might not have the best choices for themselves, or there aren't necessarily, perfect parallels between personal flourishing and what serves the common good, even if ultimately we want to cultivate ways of life where those things go together, right? Especially in crisis, especially in terms of like the development of the bomb before the Nazis get it. Like,
yeah.
It makes sense, maybe this destroys family life to have to be involved in this,
That's very true. I think in general, but you do make me think of a little, a kind of funny irony of the film, I guess, where you have, he sets up this town. Yeah. He builds like a Wild West sort of like frontier
commune.
Yeah, frontier settlement for all these commie physicists and stuff, like literal log cabins and shit out there. And it's got a full dress welfare state, medical services, everything. All the wives come with, and they
egalitarian. The wives are working in important positions. You even have a wife who I think knows. I don't know if she's a chemist or what her deal is, but she's like involved with the physicists and discussing important things, right?
Right. Yeah. You have a little cracking of the gender sort of ice cap, and then everybody's having kids. There's a funny scene where the Matt Damon general, whatever his name is, I forget. It's been a long time. He's complaining about, we're having 10 births a month here in this village. And it's like, that looks like really cool, like a nice place to live, plainly, flourishing community to build the weapon to end the world, Well,
yeah. And that's the thing. It's like it's ironic. What they're coming together for is this terrible thing in a certain way. Although again, for like the goal of defeating the Nazis, but like what it actually results is in order to do the great thing, everyone has to contribute whatever they can. And it does show that like communist principles of cooperation and each according to their need, but don't forget the other part of that, from each according to their need to, from each according to their ability to each according to their need, right? Yeah. The Marxist principle is that like everyone has to contribute whatever they can. And that was what was needed there, right? You didn't have people being squeezed out and taking advantage of the way that markets can kind of gouge people. You didn't have that; those forces were not ideal for accomplishing the goal, right? So that was interesting.
There's one last sort of political question that I wanted to talk about, and that's the choice to not show the bombs going off. The bombs hit. Well, it shows the test one at Trinity, New Mexico, but not the actual bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And also doesn't show the dispossession of like the Native Americans from this territory where they built.
Although interestingly, it does have Oppenheimer telling the military that what should happen after is the land should be given back to the indigenous people. And they kind of laugh at him.
Yeah. And they didn't. It's still there to this day. It's still a big research laboratory. This criticism, I don't know. I mean, I know it was very intentional, I think, not to show, because like it's something that you certainly would think about making this movie. But I think the intention is to show, how like the development of technology can make the questions of how you use it so abstract, where it really doesn't hit viscerally until afterwards. It's like, there's this very disturbing scene, like where he's giving this speech to like a rah crowd after, it's like it worked, it blew up Hiroshima, and, he's sort of
very
saying,
uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I only wish we'd gotten it to use against the Germans. And then as he's leaving, he hallucinates like stepping on like a charred corpse, like some that's been like almost vaporized by the nuclear explosion. I think that it would have been, I mean, it's certainly not missing from the film, the idea that this was used, like it hangs over everything, and it's taken for granted that the audience is thinking about this. And it's shown in that sort of hallucination scene that it's like, oh, this is a horrible atrocity has been committed. To show it directly would be, I don't know, almost, you could see it being almost insulting, or like trying to make it into a sort of, melodramatic, like right. gut punch by showing the mass murder of whatever 70,000 people, or and
yeah, that's an interesting point.
But I think as a film, the intention is to show you like what their perspective actually was, and their perspective by and large was they didn't know really that much about Japan and didn't give a shit. It really didn't enter into the equation until it was too late. It was about the Germans first, and then it was like, well, the Japanese haven't surrendered yet, so we're just throwing this thing in. And it just wasn't part of the equation for almost anybody until after it was already finished.
No, it's true. I mean, look, I think, who knows, but I think there could have been a version of the film that did show either actual footage of the bombings in Japan or some visual representation of that in a way that would work.
Yeah.
But that's not the film that was made. And I think the film that was made succeeds and doesn't do what I think some critics from the left say that it does, which is like, center the white experience. Okay. Well, you're centering the stories about a white guy, like American, well, not American, but like, Oppenheimer, his perspective is the film's perspective. And, I see in that powerful scene where he hallucinates, and not just what you pointed out, but also like the faces in the crowd starts to like melt away as if they were, hit by the bomb as well, right? Like, it's like, okay, so people are like, well, look, it's only white faces that you're showing, so are you saying that only, people can only resonate with the death of white people or something? And I think that's just an ill-fitting critique. I don't think it really gets the film. It's a kind of critique that you would write if you read about the film but didn't watch it. I don't know, because it is, I think, obviously a powerful film about the devastation, destruction, violence, terror of this power. And the whole film is about his wrestling with this and his guilt over it. And the visuals, like you pointed out, I think were very powerful because of how they capture something that either you show like actual footage of something and then you're still at a remove, right? Like there's something to what you're saying. This doesn't, by analogy, it's almost like the idea that you shouldn't draw an image of God or something like an image of something is not the thing itself. And as you say, you could minimize or, reduce the power of or sentimentalize or make melodramatic something by trying to portray it because it's so terrible that in the attempt to capture it, you're minimizing it. Like, I think there's something to that. And that's why you have to go to the artistic renderings. Yeah. It's like, think about like Picasso, right? Like, it wasn't realism that captured the disasters of modernity in Picasso. It was like, he intentionally had to take an artistic distortion and rendering in order to capture the truly awful. You know what I mean? And like, I do think there's something in how Nolan dealt with it that was commendable and that worked. I was moved, by his imagery, very much so. I thought the shimmering, like there's something that like gave you a sense. You heard and saw glimpses of this thing that you could not imagine. And that seeing it visually would not help you imagine actually the actual reality of, I don't think.
Yeah. As you say, I think there would have been, I think I agree that there would have been tasteful ways to do it, but like to just have like a CGI rendering, of the whole city being leveled, like right. with whiz bang special effects, I think that would have been more offensive than
almost
anything
insulting
else.
And offensive. Yeah, that's right.
And we should note there have been a number of by all accounts, very excellent Japanese films made explicitly about the bombing. And I think maybe that also played into Nolan's thinking where he didn't want to sort of tread on their toes, remake a film that has already been made. So, yeah, it's certainly, I mean, it's not only during that one scene as during the administrative hearing, there's also bits where, he imagines a bomb going off and like the guy's face being lit up by the nuclear fire. It was like clearly he's like haunted by this all the time, thinking about, what could happen to anybody in any major city at any point. It
occurs to me at the beginning of the film, there's these beautiful images of like the universe and sunspots and his imagination is obviously like connected to the wonders of the universe in a kind of beautiful, awe-inspiring way. And then later on, his hallucinations or his imaginings are of like the capacities of that universe in this terrible way. So I don't know. I think it's a very well done juxtaposition of those kinds of images that this person whose excellence was all consumed with these mysteries of the universe. I don't know. I think it's a very good way to explore how modernity has abused the mysteries of the universe for terrible ends.
Yeah. Oh, and one last comment. I forgot to wrap up my Truman thought. The reason everyone thinks that Truman made the decision to drop the nuclear bombs is because he went around after the fact and saying that he had to justify the decision. It was something that was so horrifying that it needed, you couldn't just say, well, we did it because we could. And we were in like this berserker blood rage and we didn't care about Japanese civilians. It was like, no, we did it because otherwise we would have had to invade and that would have killed like 1 million GIs, et cetera, et cetera. Whether or not that's true, it just is not the case that Truman made that order. The machinery was already set in motion before he became president at all. And his actual only action was the very human one to say no more of this stuff without my explicit command, which he never gave, which, it turned out to be irrelevant. But yeah, how the logic of this and the power politics, I think that's also, you could make an analogy to Oppenheimer that actually they're quite similar in a way, to where he had to distort history and erase his own humanity to tell a lie about why it was necessary to do this. Basically, at the end of the day, right. Probably unnecessary action. Certainly the second one, at least.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my final thought is something that I think you'll appreciate too. The moral quandaries that come later don't erase the very good motivation of people seeking to use science for a just cause, to prevent the Nazis from destroying the world and destroying, the Jews. And it's incredible it wasn't just Oppenheimer, whether it's the general, whether it's Oppenheimer. People got shit done at an incredible pace with incredible pressure and complicated problems of science, of strategy, of military and political maneuvering. And we've talked in the past about the New Deal and like the incredible things that were built and just the unbelievable like decision making on a mass scale to invest money and energy and like just have to pull off something where you're not sure if you can do it and the timeline is unclear, and it's just like the stakes are as high as it gets and everyone's like, yep, let's do it, let's get the greatest minds and just fucking like pull it together and do it, right? And there was something I was like, man, could you imagine? And I know there's all these tropes about the greatest generation or whatever, but like the people in that film, if they looked at us today and how we deal with today's problems, I could just imagine like what a bunch of like just, you know what I mean? Like I could just the dripping contempt for how poorly we respond to crisis in a collective way, right? I think what would be evident. They pulled off phenomenal things that required intelligence and collaboration and just dedication and principle. And there was something to me that was inspiring about all that, because we need that kind of energy and the moral courage and the navigating of complex like political games and like thinking existentially about your role in all these moral and political quandaries. There's a lot there to admire. If like there's a lot of Sophie's Choice stuff going on, right? There's not a lot of moral clarity other than like, let's minimize death and let's defeat the bad guys. But like the way from interpersonal marital strife to political to scientific problems, the way that people cared about doing whatever they could to involve themselves in the better outcome of those struggles. I think there's a lot there to draw inspiration from. It's something that's needed today. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess, in a total war context, like total war mobilization, that's surely that sort of can't be replicated precisely. That's the sort of pressure that doesn't, you can't just magic out of the air. But
you would think that climate change would be that kind of pressure, though, right? I know that it's an amorphous enemy, but like the results of not defeating that problem are the same in a way, right?
Yeah, possibly worse. Well, I guess that's the thing. It's like, the Manhattan Project, you're like pushing forward the boundaries of theoretical physics and chemistry in like several directions at the same time, while also doing like one of the most complicated and difficult engineering challenges ever.
That's right.
And like, we don't really need to accomplish that type of project. Like if we could just build a high-speed rail line in less than, it's like, when did they start the one in California? In like 2009, and it's like not even halfway done. Yeah, that's right. The some of that Oppenheimer energy to like fix our national grid and the Amtrak and it can't be that hard. We're looking at shit that Japan's had for 70 years. Like, come on, guys, let's get it together. We have gotten it together in the past in harder times with less resources. So like, come on.
That's right. Yeah. And the last thing is that the staffer in the film who is prepping Robert Downey Jr.'s character, the Strauss guy, was phenomenal. And look, there's been a lot of staffers that have been quitting and objecting to what's going on in Congress over Gaza. But that staffer was phenomenal because he was prepping, doing his job, but also he kind of gives it to him here and there. And at the end, especially about how kind of narcissistic and self-absorbed he is and kind of, it's like, yeah, there are young people who don't have a lot of power who are principled, who kind of stand up to these assholes. And that's a real thing too. And that's worth celebrating. So yeah, at the end of the day, I thought I was moved by the film, a lot of things to think about, a lot to connect with, and a lot to draw from for today. So
yeah, 3-hour drama where people are mostly sitting in rooms talking, and it holds your attention and is very stimulating, thought provoking. Like shit, what more can you ask for from Hollywood?
That's right. That's right. Bring it on, baby. We'll take more of that, please.
Great. Well, that's probably a good place to stop. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.